Hello, and welcome to this video where we're going to take a look at social contract theory as our continuation of examining basic ethical systems. So the basis of social contract theory is living according to kind of established rules within a society. And so the question becomes, where do the rules come from? And so if we are going to be following the tenets of social contract theory, basically what is in the contract? What is kind of the expected behavior? What are the expected kind of outcomes associated with those behaviors that have been established in a set of rules, or as it's described in this, a social contract? So when you're looking at a social contract in this realm of social contract theory, you raise the question, what is that social community? What is the kind of the extent at which these contract or in which these rules apply? And so we could ask the further question, can a person create and live by their own rules in isolation? Or are they dependent upon the rules of the society, the greater society in which they live? So in determining what type of rules or what's going to be included within this social contract, we have to ask the question, what is the nature of humanity? So if we take a look at human beings and ask the question, are people naturally good and kind of occasionally doing bad things? Or basically, are we at risk of a dystopian kind of reality in which people are naturally bad and they're going to act out and act according to this kind of bad premise, except for the fear of laws and punishment. And so they would act good only in response to following these rules, and only following these rules as a result of avoiding the repercussions or the consequences of their actions. Now, for the followers of social contract theory, they're going to be of the mindset that basically, in the absence of social order, in the absence of these rules, or in the absence of this contract establishing what is kind of appropriate and ethical behavior, society is going to break down. And therefore, society, in the absence of these rules, or in the absence of the laws and the expectations that come with a social contract, society is going to be vulnerable to those primitive and explosive passions that are going to be kind of let loose in the absence of a fear of punishment. Now, a good example of this is in the novel by William Gooding, Lord of the Flies, which came out in 1954 and received the Nobel Prize in Literature. Or William Golding received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1983. Basically says that no external devil is needed because he is present within us and only held back by the presence of society's rules. So in order to avoid that breakdown of society into some type of dystopian nightmare, the proponents of social contract theory basically feel that a social contract, or a set of rules and expectations, are necessary to establish and maintain a social and productive society. And so within a social contract, what we're looking at is that a group of people are going to come together and collectively agree to what is necessary in order for those individuals to behave morally. And so the goal of this is basically to reduce social chaos, to establish rules within society as to how we are going to be respectfully interacting with one another. And if we avoid this social chaos, if we avoid this dystopia, what we're going to end up with is a peaceful society in which the individuals are following the tenets, the rules within this social contract. So to reinforce this perspective, why is it that we need to be moral? Why does society need these moral rules? The followers of social contract theory basically say that in the absence of rules, we're going to revert to some state of primitive nature. in which we have no common ways of life. And so if there are no common ways or no common expectations, people are going to do basically whatever it is that they want. And so in the absence of this moral code, in the absence of this social contract, we're not going to have enforced laws. We're not going to have moral rules which are going to be dictating what is appropriate behavior, and therefore we can't have justice or injustice because we have no basis for determining what is the appropriate behavior. And this, again, similar to the Lord of the Flies, could revert into a situation where we have basically a conflict, an adversarial relationship between each and every member within the society. So for those individuals that then ascribe to and basically sign on to this social contract, their explanations for why be moral is to have some type of morality associated with it. And so we're defining it with a definition, so that doesn't quite work. So why should an individual be moral within a just and ethical society? It could be that the individuals seek self-respect. They're going to feel better about themselves if they're acting appropriately within society. For other people, it may be so that individuals like them. In general, people are going to be more likable, more amenable to making friends with somebody that is acting appropriately, acting, as would be expected within the standards within a society. For other individuals, they may decide to be moral, to follow the rules of society in order to avoid the consequences of acting inappropriately. So to avoid punishment, to avoid breaking the laws and potentially going to jail. For others, it may be to please an authority figure, whether that authority figure is somebody that they're looking up to within society or a deity, to please their God by acting according to God's rules that have been established. And then finally, for some individuals, they may choose to be role models for future generations. So role models for their children's and the generation that's coming after them. That they are basically kind of showing what it is to follow the rules of society and act in a just, ethical, and moral manner. So Thomas Hobbes is a philosopher that is often associated with these views of social contract theories. And basically, he came out and said, in his answer, why does society know moral rules? He came out and is quoted as saying in his book Leviathan from 1651, moral philosophy is nothing else but the science of what is good and evil in the conversation and in society of mankind. So basically determining what is good and what is evil, what is appropriate within a society and what would be viewed as inappropriate and should not be done. But then he continued on. Good and evil are names that signify our appetites and aversions, which in different tempers, customs, and doctrines of men are different. Again, indicating that a social contract theory may be different from one location to another location, because it is basically a contract that is entered into and signing on to the rules of what would be appropriate behavior. Similarly, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, founder of the Art of Living Foundation and International Association of Human Values, is quoted as to saying, conflict is the nature of the world. Comfort is the nature of the self. Amidst the conflict, seek comfort. So in the kind of absence of world order, in the absence of rules, in the absence of a social contract, we're going to have conflict. And so the goal then is to seek out that which will allow you to find comfort within the society and avoid the conflict that comes about by the lack of rules and the lack of standards associated with that. So to put this more explicitly, and again, a quote attributed to Canadian Prime Minister Lester Pearson, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957, understanding the nature of conflict leads to peace. And so if we recognize that the followers of the social contract theory feel that in the absence of laws and rules, people are going to revert to a primitive natural state. And in that primitive natural state, they're going to be acting on what is their own perceived self-interest, basically following the tenets of egoism, which we're covering in a different set of videos within this series. And so without these rules, without this kind of expectation as to what is appropriate within society, individuals are going to seek gratification and avoid personal harm, but it's going to be based on their ideas, based on what they want. And in reality, that is going to come into conflict with what other individuals that they're interacting with are going to want for their own, kind of own gratification. So when we're looking at the establishment of a social contract, basically what we're looking at is the equivalent of a covenant. The equivalent of a set of rules and laws that are going to put in place for the society, for the community, whether we're talking a small community or kind of a larger society as a whole. But we're basically looking at an individual kind of giving up some level of individual freedom, giving up some level of individual liberty in order to receive protection. In order to receive the kind of stability that comes within a society that is actually functioning. And so for those individuals, they are signing on to this covenant. They're signing on to this social contract in order to receive, in essence, social control, to receive kind of peace within the community. For others, there would be a fear of punishment because in this social contract, it is not just going to have, what are the rules and laws, but it has to be enforceable. There have to be penalties associated with that for not following the code of conduct. And so individuals would be viewed as acting unethically, and then because of those unethical or immoral actions, they would then be faced with the consequences of those actions. So if we take a look at this, we can see that the social order is going to be benefiting from the fact that we have these rules in place, these tenets in place. It's going to keep society from falling apart. It's going to allow individuals to work together peacefully and civilly because there's some expectation as to what would be appropriate behavior within them. Ideally, it's going to reduce human suffering and promote human flourishing because we'd have a functional society in which people are working towards, hopefully, at least some level of a common good. In the situation where conflicts do arise, the presence of rules and the presence of expectations are going to allow for the resolution of these conflicts of interest in just and orderly ways, as opposed to being arbitrary and potentially capricious. And then with this series of rules, tenets, however you want to think about that, you have the ability then to assign praise to those that are acting appropriately and blame to those that are acting inappropriately, to reward those productive members of society and punish those that are acting immorally. And so we have, with those series of rules and tenets, some kind of expectations so how society is going to be operating. So to answer the question, why should I be moral? For those individuals that are signing on to the social contract theory view, they're doing it for harmony of the soul. The view that immorality corrupts. And virtue purifies. And so if an individual is acting appropriately and according to the moral expectations for society, they're going to be at peace within themselves. Again, for others that are not seeking that inner peace, it may simply be a fear of punishment, whether that punishment is coming from an authority figure in the form of a deity or society as a whole for a resulting in a punishment or consequences associated with their immoral actions. So this painting of the death of Socrates, painted in 1787 by Jacques-Louis David, we're taking a look at basically what happened at the end of Socrates' life. In roughly 399 BC, Socrates was accused of failing to acknowledge the gods and corrupting the Athenian youth. In a trial, he was convicted and received the death penalty, in which he was to drink a poison. He was basically to drink hemlock. Now, his friends came to him, urged him to flee Athens, to go into exile to avoid and escape execution. But what Socrates stated is that he had an obligation, an overwhelming obligation to obey those laws, because the laws were the basis of his entire life, his entire way of life. And so how could he, as this leader of thought and this individual who's really telling people how that they should, or leading people into the discussion of how they should be acting appropriately, how could he act inappropriately? How could he go against the tenets of society? How could he break the rules by avoiding the consequences of his actions? So then the basis of social contract theory is basically to establish what is the expectation for character. And so this social contract theory is based then on this idea that if we have rules, we have these expectations that are established within our society, these habits then are going to force us into predictable behavior. Because reality, it's hard to turn morality on and off. We can't switch very easily from acting morally to acting immorally, again, under most circumstances. And so for many individuals, then, that feeling of guilt associated with acting immorally would diminish the gains of acting immorally. Yeah, I want something, but if I steal that something in order to have it, I'm going to feel guilty and I'm not going to enjoy having it. So therefore, I should not act immorally and steal that object of my affection. Now, as with many of these ethical theories, there are some limitations to it. There are some critiques. There are some criticisms associated with it. And so one example of a contemporary critique of social contract theory is basically who established the contract. Most traditional social contracts are based on a patriarchy. They're based on kind of a male-dominant society and are basically written from that male perspective. And in so doing so, they often involve a diminishment of the female perspective, or involve a power dynamic that is over, basically providing the male with power over the female. And so examples of this, and again, kind of extending this a little bit beyond just simple ethical and moral codes, looking at the marriage contract as an example of a social contract. As of 1993, marital rape was listed as a crime in all of the states, but there were exceptions, exemptions from prosecution if physical force was not involved. And so, basically looking at, it was allowed, marital rape was allowed under some circumstances based on the code in place, based on the contract in place during that period of time. And now since that time, some of the laws have been updated, but it has not been done universally across all of the states. A further critique of social contract theory is that you can take a look at who is accepted into society, who is able to enter into agreement with this social contract. And so basically you can look at this, who has full rights under the social contract and who has diminished rights. Who is considered a full and moral and political person, in which cases they would have the full rights and freedoms associated with it. But are there others that are denied the ability to enter into the contract and are relegated as to objects of that contract and being recognized in essence to have fewer rights and freedoms? And so if we take a look at this, again, taking a look at this from a contemporary perspective, we can see that perhaps the existing social contract that was written by the founding fathers of the United States, if we were to take a look at that, didn't take into account the rights of the women, didn't take into account the rights of African Americans. And because of that, this social contract may need to be adjusted as we have come to recognize the freedom and the rights of those individuals. We haven't always, society hasn't always caught up and provided these free and full access to these rights associated with the social contract. So this gives rise to our ethical dilemma in science for this first portion of our social contract theory discussion. Does the current social contract work in our 21st century global society? Who should be involved in the creation or updating of a social contract? How would you update our existing social contract to reflect current realities of race, gender, socioeconomic status, and other things? And then finally, what should be included in a modern social contract? Thank you for listening to this video. As always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you and have a great day.